Guest today is Dr. Richard Haass. Richard is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and also the author of a new book called The World, A Brief Introduction. So we're going to ask him what he thinks the future of the world after COVID might look like.
The world after COVID is going to look an awful lot like the world before COVID, with very few exceptions. What we're seeing now is already identifiable before COVID. And again, what it's done is brought it into greater relief. We knew, for example, that the global health machinery was inadequate. Various guidelines have been issued over the decades, and countries were not in compliance with it. We knew the World Health Organization didn't really have the power to require or force countries to meet their international obligations, and many countries, beginning with China and others, have not met their international obligations. Before COVID, climate change was emerging as a great, if not the greatest, international problem. Well, it still is. If anything, things have gotten slightly worse because world's attention has been focused elsewhere. Cyberspace remains just as unregulated and unstructured as it was. Interference in political processes is continuing. The major relationship of this era between the United States and China was deteriorating before any of us heard of COVID-19, and it continues to deteriorate. In some ways, COVID has intensified the scope or depth of the problems. U.S.-Russia relations, or Russia's relations with outsiders, is no better. Russia is still entrenched in Ukraine. It's still using force in indiscriminate ways in Syria. So I could go on and on. So to me, what's so interesting about COVID is it's not a transformational event. It has large consequences for human life, large consequences for economics. Ultimately, though, we will get to a point where we can manage.
Does the experience of this moment change our ability to manage the world post-COVID?
What COVID has done is it's reinforced the message that the world matters, that many aspects of globalization are realities rather than choices. The choice comes in how you respond to it. But COVID shows the reality of infectious disease. What begins in Wuhan doesn't stay in Wuhan. Now, that reality was true beforehand. Indeed, in the book you mentioned, In the World, I have a chapter on global public health, and I said it's only a question of when, not if, there will be an infectious disease pandemic. What it's done is underscored again for people who would like to ignore the world, that they do so at their peril, in the same way that 9/11 did that when, in the case of terrorism. I'd like to be able to say to you and others that this is the sort of crisis that will galvanize the sort of international response we would like to see, that we need to see, whether it's in public health or more broadly, say to deal with climate, to deal with other international challenges. But I've got to be honest with you, I don't see that. What's so remarkable to me about the response to COVID is how weak the collective international response has been. I don't see the World Health Organization materially improving. Efforts to build a global mechanism to develop, produce, distribute a vaccine are quite weak. Important countries, including my own, are not participating in it. The contradiction or the irony is here we have this great global problem, and what matters most is not the collective global response, but rather individual national responses.
What has surprised you? Would you have predicted that the world would react to this moment the way it has?
It sounds somewhat self-serving to say I would have predicted exactly this, but in general, this is very consistent with what we've seen. One of the most popular phrases in the foreign policy, international relations world is this idea of international community. What COVID has exposed yet again is that this phrase is aspirational rather than actual. I'd like there to be an international community, but there isn't one for the most part.
On the other side of COVID, if there was a gathering of world leaders and you were speaking to them, what would you say to them?
So I would hope that countries would see that it's in their own self-interest to put aside some of their concerns about their own sovereignty and realize that their own well-being is directly correlated, directly connected to the collective ability of the world to deal with issues like public health, like proliferation, like terrorism, like climate change. Secondly, and related to that, the leaders of the world really need to rethink sovereignty. It can't be an absolute. Now, they're already there. When they went on record saying governments don't have a free hand to massacre their own people, that was accepting certain limits to sovereignty. Well, I think, for example, it's essential that governments accept certain limits to what they're allowed to do on policies that affect climate change, that affect everybody. Countries should not be allowed to ignore global health regulations about their responsibilities in terms of infectious disease. What we need to have in the 21st century is some original thinking, some new thinking. We need to respect sovereignty in terms of not using force to change borders, but sovereignty can't be an absolute when it comes to the willingness or unwillingness of governments to meet obligations when there are things going on inside their territory that has detrimental or adverse implications for others. So what we really need is a new global compact. That is something for world leaders to focus on.